Crisis Control, brought to you by Xerilio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.
Hello, I'm Amber Sherlock and welcome to Crisis Control. We're taking a deep dive into the risks facing business today to discover how smart companies are using technology to reduce risk and reap the rewards on offer. In today's episode, the rise of the CISO will examine why this relatively new job function is critical and increasingly a feature of the C-suite. We'll also examine the changing dynamics in the industry, evolving best practice and key cyber concerns. But first, let's take a closer look at the role.
The CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. It's a role the Australian Cybersecurity Centre says requires a combination of technical and soft skills, as well as continuous learning and upskilling to keep pace with ever-changing cyber threats and new technologies. The CISO oversees a company's cybersecurity program to protect against threats internal and external, working with the Chief Information Officer to manage disaster recovery and business continuity plans. Increasingly, the CISO is becoming a feature of the C-suite and boardroom meetings.
So gone are the days where, a CEO or a board of directors can hire a CIO or a chief security officer and say that's their job, their responsibility to protect our business. That's the old school way of thinking. Now it's got to be everybody's job, and everybody's got to wear that hat, right?
The CISO not only protects against cyber threats and oversees the response to an incident, but importantly, is able to translate whether security risks are operational risks, be that financial or legal. The rise of the CISO has been accentuated by the pandemic, with remote working and increasing demand for this relatively new and in-demand position.
So we've seen that that's added a lot to the demand as well, particularly in areas like fintech.
Further information about guidelines for cybersecurity roles can be found on the Australian Cybersecurity Centre website.
Joining me today is Robert Busque, Regional Vice President, Asia Pacific at Verizon Business Group, Jamie Norton, Partner at McGrathNicol, Board Member and former CISO at the ATO, and Michelle Price, Partner at EY Oceania. Thank you for your time today. First, let's look at the role of the CISO. We'll go to you, James, first. Typically in Australia, cybersecurity sits within the domain of technology, which itself often isn't the biggest concern of senior stakeholders. Do you think the rising role of a CISO will overcome this?
Yeah, I think the role of the CISO has grown out of that technology space, but certainly we're seeing a lot more cyber risks present at board level, and with that, I guess the oversight and the accountability of cyber as a key business risk, and that's certainly something that's continuing, and we are slowly seeing that sort of rise of security and cyber out of that technical aspect and into the boardroom and the appropriate managing of risk that presents.
Well, you've actually had experience at board level. What sorts of conversations are being had about the CISO, and how's it being viewed, and what are the sort of challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think the CISO role is becoming very much an influencer role. So it's about having those conversations at board level and being able to articulate the risks to an organisation. And then that gives board members and the executive leadership team the ability to then influence those risks and manage those risks appropriately across the myriad of other risks they've got in an organisation, whether that be financial or legal or otherwise. So I think it's that context that really needs to happen, that cyber becomes another key business risk that needs to be managed, and the role of the CISO really is to be that influencer and ensure that those risks are appropriately represented at the board level.
Robert, let's go to you. How can security leaders get senior leadership to care about cyber risks?
I think the first thing is to accept and understand that cyber risk is business risk. It is a strategic risk to the organisation in the same way that many others are. Occupational health and safety and financial risk needs to be looked at through that same lens. It's also increasing in complexity exponentially. It's no longer just about the technology, it's also about the human element. We know from our research that 82% of all cyber breaches included some type of human interaction, whether it's social engineering or some other element. And so it's not just about the technology, it is all about the people, and it is all about the overall business risk that they're exposed to.
And do you think this is a conversation that's being had in businesses?
In sophisticated organisations, definitely. But cybersecurity is a continuum, and it's a continuum that almost never ends. And so understanding where you are in terms of that maturity today and what defines success for you as an organisation is a key part of that strategic story for a CISO to tell.
Do you think security has a place in the C-suite?
It absolutely has a place at the board table,
Yeah.
And should do for organisations both large and small.
Okay, Michelle, let's go to you. How much is regulatory compliance perhaps helping or hindering the role of cyber resilience within companies? We're seeing a lot of this governance, but is it a good thing?
It's definitely a good thing, and it's not just us in this conversation that know that to be the case. It's actually globally a trend that we're seeing across all countries, not just those that we consider to be in the Western world, but really everywhere. And I think the regulatory environment has at times been very challenging for the cyber domain, but it is improving. What we need to see around the regulatory space is some comfort from directors and also the C-suite more broadly, that the intersection of technology with business in terms of people and process is something that we do need to take an integrated view. And therefore, from a regulatory point of view, the regulations need to take account of the pace and scale of technological reach. That's where the challenges really do occur now in those more sophisticated organisations, and where it causes confusion in smaller organisations and those that are large but less mature.
In terms of cybersecurity, is it perhaps a case of not what you do, but often what you don't do?
Yeah, look, I think that is the case definitely when it comes to the awareness piece, and what you don't do can be the thing a bit like turning on or turning off the lights as you're leaving the building that can cause you to have the incident that no one wants to have. Certainly you can never do too much, but where we place emphasis is where we need to focus the conversation. It's not necessarily about how much technology you have in play that's helping you from a security standpoint, it's about the how. And this is what all of us in the security industry are increasingly advising everybody else in the economy. It's the how of cybersecurity that matters. And it really is focused around the people that are engaging with technologies that are the most important piece here. And to really, it's a team sport to help each other rather than throw bricks at situations that we observe could have been done better. Everyone can be doing better in this equation.
James, what advice would you give to the CEO of a large organisation who said they were perhaps thinking of creating a CISO role and hadn't already?
Yeah, I think the CISO is an important role within an organisation, but I think security really needs to start at the top, and I think the CEOs and boards need to take this really seriously. But it's also a company-wide concern as well. So the CISO is a facilitator in that regard, and will help identify the risks and the controls and what needs to be done. But it's a serious thing that needs to happen across the firm, across all aspects of a business, and I think the CISO really then becomes the piece that draws all that together and helps identify where a business needs to focus their efforts.
Robert, how much of an issue is organisational culture in many Aussie firms in terms of recognising that they do actually need a CISO?
Well, firstly, it's the understanding that it's not a case of if but when a cyber event occurs for an organisation. If you use that as a baseline, you can change the conversation and hopefully change the culture of the company and the organisation and their approach to the overall risk posture that they deem necessary for their organisation. It remains a challenge today for organisations to help non-technical employees understand just how fallible technology systems can be and how susceptible to attack they can be.
Michelle, what do you think organisations should be looking for when they are looking to hire a CISO? What are the important qualities? I mean, we've talked about how important it is maybe to get non-technological people involved. Do you think sometimes they make this role and it's too sort of IT focused and it's just not drilling down to other employees? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, gone are the days where we are looking at a CISO who is someone who has deep technical knowledge. Having technical knowledge is an important factor. But more importantly, as we've already touched on in the discussion, communication is so critical. The ability to be able to translate the technical into the non-technical for the broader organisation, as well as customers and upstream, downstream suppliers, partners, and the regulatory environment. It's incredibly important that the person knows how to communicate effectively to a range of different audiences. And of course, most importantly, as an extension to that communication piece is leadership. The ability to herd cats, if we can put it that way, is a part of that leadership piece, but really being able to corral and focus people, particularly when an incident is happening. That is just so important to make sure that not only your teams are maintaining trust and can focus on the issues at hand, but also the environment can continue to trust the organisation and trust that individual to focus on what needs to get done. In between incidents, of course, it is about that influence piece. And so when you wrap that all together, we're looking at strategic thinking as much as communication, as much as that influence piece.
James, let me ask you the same question. What should organisations be looking for in a CISO?
Yeah, I agree. The ability to bring those disparate areas of the firm sort of together on that journey around security, and you know, you've got areas that are going to be very technically FA, but you've got a lot of other areas of the business that security is really only just emerging into their world at the moment. So it's that ability to influence and corral people through and onto the same page, and then also the leadership ability to actually bring those risks to bear in the more senior levels of the organisation to get actual action happening at that senior level that flows down into the business. So I think that's an immensely critical part, and the communication skills and soft skills effectively that go with that are far more important these days for that CISO role than you know, coming out of the technical ranks and having that technical understanding.
James, let me put a situation to you. A candidate for a CISO role has been put forward, but look, they were at an organisation that had a really big security incident. Should this be looked at as a positive or a negative?
That's a very good question. I think these days we definitely do not want to hang anyone out to dry for any kind of incident that's occurred on their watch. It's a case of when, not if, in a lot of cases. And if you're sufficiently targeted by an aggressor, they're going to find ways normally to find, you know, to get into your network. So I don't think we hang anyone out to dry. I think you know, it's a learning experience for a lot of CISOs, and having that live incident response is actually potentially a benefit in a lot of cases because of the learnings that come out of that. So I think we certainly don't rule people out for having incidents on their watch.
Michelle, I see you nodding. Do you agree?
I'm in fierce agreement. I think that experience can be so invaluable, not just because of the way, that's that how again, the way that you know, you can manage incidents, but also to be able to have that experience shared amongst colleagues. The CISO community in Australia is one that is actually quite tight, and it's one that we can benefit from above and below the role of the CISO. And you know, there's an organisation called CISO Lens in Australia that is globally unique in helping to foster that community, because it is that learning, as Jamie says, that really can put us ahead of the threat actors the next time they come around and knock on the door, because if they want to break in, they are going to break in, and they will take what they want to take, or they'll sit there and watch and learn just as much as we try to learn. So that learned experience of running incidents is just so invaluable.
Robert, as thousands of workers were flipped to working from home during the pandemic, I mean, that obviously escalated reliance on technology hugely, and therefore cyber risk as well. So what has the change seen in the last 2 years in terms of cyber risk and the need for CISOs?
So the first thing that happened is the attack surface expanded exponentially. So there are a lot more avenues and opportunities for threat actors to gain access into critical systems, with remote workers and cloud-based applications and things of that nature. So for an organisation to respond, they needed to think very differently about their security architecture and what they needed to secure. It was no longer a perimeter and the data, the sensitive data sitting behind that perimeter. It was now distributed outside of that into public cloud instances, to partners, to customers, to other third parties. So it became a very complex scenario very quickly. That was the first thing to consider. The role for the CISO then is to then think about the overall strategic approach and what's required to sustain a security environment in a very complex and rapidly changing architecture as well. And that's where our relationship between the CISO and the CIO is very important. Whether they report, one reports to the other, but they do need to work hand in glove, particularly around times of this significant and fast-paced change. So that was one key thing that occurred. I think the other thing that we learned from pandemic response is just how rapidly organisations move to digital-first interactions. And so everything that's digital becomes an opportunity or a threat vector. And so organisations then needed to think about how they secured that, how they protected that information for themselves and on behalf of their customers as well.
I mean, has there been much time for strategy? I guess we're coming out of the pandemic now, and a lot of people have just been chasing their tail. Is now the time that companies should be looking at this?
Look, we found there was a continuum.
Okay.
There were definitely organisations that were very mature, well planned, that were able to enact and change rapidly. There were others that were very much in response mode. It's been 2 years now. A lot of those organisations that were in response mode have caught up. But we need to think about cybersecurity in the context of, as someone that's trying to stop bad actors from getting in, we need to be right 100% of the time. They only need to be right or successful 1% of the time. So it's a very asymmetrical relationship between us and the threat actors, and we need to make sure that we're focusing very much, as Michelle mentioned, on it being a team sport.
Michelle, as companies continue to increase their dependence on technology, how do you see the CISO role growing?
That's a great question, actually. I think it's going to grow in the sense that as we get more digital and we do increase that dependence, the CISO and its function, it's a function within an organisation where there is a strategy presence, has to almost mimic the business, and it's there to enable the digitisation and digitalisation of an organisation with trust. At the end of the day, that's what this function is all about. It's about enabling trust in a cyber physical world. And so I think that rather than encroaching on sort of the physical security side, my view is that we really do need to have CISO and the CISO function focused on that digital domain to interact with the physical domain and make sure that that specialisation is right across the organisation and also supply chains from an integrated fashion. And I think we will see a huge increase in the valuation, if you like, or the placement of value on the function when we see that return on investment start to come post-pandemic, as we survive supply chains getting back on deck again and realising that a lot of digitisation happened very quickly, as Robert was saying, and now we need to convert on that and embed that true value of what it is to be digital, but for the digitisation to be trusted.
James, looking towards the future, what are you seeing as the biggest cyber risks that Australian companies are facing?
Yeah, it's certainly rapidly evolving, and I think we've come out a period where the cybercrime element's been a large contributor to the incidents we've seen around things like ransomware and those kind of criminal actors. But more and more, we're also seeing geopolitical risks coming into the frame now. With the war in Ukraine and with other threats to with China to our north. So I think more and more we'll see those geopolitical and even the mix, I guess, of geopolitical and criminal actors working through together as well. So I think that's going to be really interesting for companies, particularly in the areas of supply chain and just the tip of the iceberg elements that's happening in that supply chain element where we're only just really starting to address that today, and we've got massive risks potentially under the surface there, around software and hardware supply chain. So I think that's going to be an area of concern moving forward, and that will mean the CISO role and security will need to continue to evolve from the technology function where it still largely is today and into a much more broader business function.
Robert, given what James has just said, in terms of best practice, what are the key things Australian companies should be implementing in terms of cybersecurity?
Right now, if you think about where we've come from over the last 10 years, much of the focus has been on data, securing corporate systems or applications. That's been very important work. It needs to continue. There needs to be a really significant focus going forward on operational technology. These are the SCADA and control systems that control things like power grids, water control, industrial systems. Nowhere near as much focus or investment has gone into that operational technology over the last 10 years, and we see that as a real area of focus that Australia, not only Australia, but many economies around the world need to make sure is secured to ensure that they're well protected, they're a base to our economic prosperity.
Michelle, do you think the industry is changing fast enough to keep up with these cybersecurity risks? I mean, what needs to be done?
That's a great question too. Security, because it's been a sort of a world unto itself until quite recently, we as an industry do need to evolve. There's no two ways about that. The integrated nature of what we've been talking about today means that we do need to accelerate the way that we're keeping pace with what our own organisations need, but also what the markets need, and more broadly, what the community needs, because of course security is needed everywhere. It's not just in the workplace. And so I think that we also need to be considering the relationship between security and privacy. And of course, with the advent of the consumer data right and sort of commensurate type systems elsewhere across the world, we will see this continued integration and the expectation of customers and community members going through the roof around where trust does lie. If we have the custodians of other people's identities, then of course we do need to be thinking about baking in security and privacy, which are in essence two sides of the same coin from the very beginning. But we don't have a clean slate in very much of what we do anymore in this world, even in emerging technologies. So we really do need to be thinking about how we as an industry have that focus right from the beginning anytime we're engaging with anyone, internal or external.
Now, we're almost out of time, but I will just ask you, James, before we go, how important do you think is collective accountability for security within organisations?
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. I think it sort of talks back to what I mentioned before. We need security not just to be totally the CISO's responsibility. It's very much the board and the executive leadership team, but also more broadly across the firm. I think there's accountability for security across all those aspects, and everything, every project, every initiative that's being done across the firm needs to be done with a security lens on it, and the CISO is really there to support and make sure that's done in the best possible manner. But that accountability across the firm, I think, is critical for Australian firms to be able to really get a handle on some of the security issues, particularly with the emerging threats we've seen in critical infrastructure and other elements across the economy.
Well, some great insights today. Thank you, everyone. It is all we have time for today. Thank you to Robert, James and Michelle. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Now, let's ask a CISO.
I think I'll be really honest up front and say that depending on who you are and why you might be a target and the motivations of the cyber threat actors, really, I think what we've seen in the last few years is that everyone is a target in some form of equal measure. So before comparing risk levels across different industries, it's important to understand the motivations of the cyber threat actor. A good example might be if they're politically motivated, right? So we've seen a lot of stuff in the news lately around governments attacking governments. So if there is a political motivation behind the cyber attack, it's likely to be targeting some form of government industry or critical infrastructure as a way of causing some sort of disruption to public order. However, what I will say in my own experience is that most have some form of financial motivation, right? So most cybercrime, not all, but the overwhelming majority of it does have its basis in traditional organized crime. So therefore, most are out to make money. And so what we see a lot of is cyber criminals perpetrating widespread fraud against individuals or organizations, seeking to make some form of large financial gain. So any sector that has high value data or transactions or services that they are providing, which they can't afford to have offline for too long, such as healthcare providers, and even going back to critical infrastructure like energy providers, they're often high value targets in terms of their, keeping their services online. But, what we deal a lot with at PEXA and, dealing with the financial sector and the property sector is, any organization that has that kind of like property settlement, right? Like there's a lot of money in a single property transaction being moved around. So therefore it becomes a very tempting target for any cyber threat actor that's looking for a quick payday. So if you kind of put property into focus there, buying and selling a home is one of the most emotionally charged and financially significant transactions a person will ever make in their entire life. It's a critical milestone, and so therefore at PEXA and working across the property sector, there's a lot of work being done to make sure that we keep those transactions as secure as possible every single day. And there's a bit of a chain in that transaction, right? So, there's everyone involved, from the buyers and sellers themselves, conveyancers, lawyers, financial institutions, real estate agents, all involved in transacting highly sensitive information or data relating to the settlement of that property. So with those settlements being so financially lucrative, unfortunately, it creates a prime target for cyber criminals. And how is this done? Usually through some form of email phishing or business email compromise. It remains pretty unfortunate to date that email phishing, which we know refers to any fraudulent attempt to obtain sensitive information or data such as usernames, password, credit card information, bank account details, over by disguising oneself as a trustworthy entity or individual via electronic communication such as email, text message, phone calls, or other digital means. And spear phishing, being a very targeted type of email phishing, is what we see a lot of in sort of financial transactions in the property sector, which, where we see a lot of payment redirection scams. So a typical payment redirection scam involves pretending to be the buyer or seller, changing bank account details last minute. And it's really, again, it's really unfortunate to date that there's a lot of organizations and a lot of industries out there that are still using email as a way to transact information or sensitive information, like bank account details or credit card information or some other form of personal identifiable information. So it's very clear to us that there needs to be a zero tolerance for this kind of risk within the property sector. We as an organization are entrusted by the users of our platform to maintain a secure ecosystem for all involved in which to perform that. And the property sector itself and the financial sector, as a result, continues to undergo significant change. But what must not be compromised as a result of that change is the level of security that's provided. So there is a big importance at the moment, especially from our perspective, in making sure that we create a sense of shared accountability across the entire sector. And no matter what industry you work in, security is no longer just the responsibility of security teams like mine. So I lead a fairly large security team here at PEXA, which is all about making sure that we monitor the property transactions, all the way from start to finish and look for threats or disruptions as a result of those. But security teams like mine can't do that job on our own. So as a result of that, we have a bit of a philosophy in how we kind of go about maintaining the safety and security of digital property settlements. And that's, through security operations like we have at my team. We use different security products designed for the industry, products that are designed to help transact secure information more securely. So we take email out of the equation where we can, and we work with the users of our platform to just try and remove that risk altogether. Working in partnership with everyone who's involved across the business and the customers, right down through to the buyers and sellers, to make sure that they understand the risks and the ways to spot the risks and mitigate them. And of course, strict digital identity and monitoring, multi-factor authentication. There's a lot being said about multi-factor authentication in this day and age and what's kind of next in terms of MFA and passwords, but it still remains such a a strong way in which to make sure you maintain the security of your identity online. Look, I think there's a lot to sort of unpack there in such a short period of time. But I think what I'd like to kind of end with is that, regardless of your sector, it's really important that you make cybersecurity a priority. I think it's one of those things where people think it happens to other people or it happens to other companies. You just got to look at the list of compromises and the different motivations behind them in the last few years to understand that everyone is very much a target. I think as well that when it comes to managing cybersecurity within your organization and even within your personal life, that there is no golden ticket or silver bullet in keeping yourself cyber secure. I say within our own organization that what constitutes as good in terms of cybersecurity is an ever-moving goalpost. It's a combination of good secure infrastructure practice, education and awareness, that culture of shared responsibility that I talked about, and ongoing assurance and testing of your cybersecurity controls. Good ongoing governance and measurements of your cybersecurity controls, understanding, where your threat level is, where your threat level is increasing, what your exposure points are, just keeping that in the conversation the way you would any other risk to your business or your customers. And finally, whether you're in a sector with high value transactions or you sit on potentially lucrative data for cyber criminals, take the time to review your security posture and continuously improve it and embed it at all levels of your organization and within your own life as well.
And that wraps up Crisis Control for this week. I'm Amber Sherlock. Thanks for watching.
Crisis Control, brought to you by Xerilio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.